Well, it's time now for Explain and Verify. This week, we're looking at the rolling blackouts. It's been over 50 days without rolling blackouts. But what exactly is going on? So Samgele Masego is here to tell us exactly what is happening. So Samgele, what's going on?
Well, Bongiwe, a very interesting political football that we are seeing. Some are claiming that this reprieve is for the elections by the governing party, whilst the governing party and Eskom saying it's the good work that they are doing through the Energy Action Plan and also led by President Ramaphosa and Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa. While South Africans are enjoying a rare streak of uninterrupted electricity supply right before the general elections on the 29th of May. Today is the 57th consecutive day without any load shedding. The reprieve is the longest period South Africans have consistently had uninterrupted electricity supply in more than 2 years. The electricity minister is thrilled with Eskom's latest performance, especially after Andre Derrita's dismal performance at the power utility. Let's just listen to what Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa had to say.
The bigger point I'm making is that the kind of performance that we are seeing is orchestrated, is deliberate, is on the back, first of the Energy Action Plan that outlines, if you like, 5 outcomes, and then Eskom then zeroed in on those elements of the Energy Action Plan that are within their domain and developed their own strategy, which is what informs the levels of plant maintenance. It informs the kinds of targets that the board would have set for management, and the Eskom team is executing diligently against that target.
This much welcome reprieve has drawn suspicions from some members of the public and political formations who view this as an election ploy by the current administration to lure you voters to vote for the African National Congress, risk of losing its parliamentary majority for the very first time in the 3 decades that South Africa has had a democratic dispensation. The recovery coincides with political parties ramping up their campaigns before the much anticipated general election. Undoubtedly, these power cuts are likely to affect how South Africans would vote, especially now, Bongiwe, that there are no power cuts. Some South Africans are saying that, well, we may well give the governing party a second chance, but you go to areas such as Orange Farm, Soweto, you go to areas such as in Mukhali City, where Nomvula Mokonyane is from. They've had to go by for 3 years without electricity, particularly after those transformers blew up. I remember in the 2021 general election, the president of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, going to Soweto, he went to many areas where there were no transformers. Just recently in Orange Farm, when he was campaigning, there was an area where there had been no transformers for the past 3 years. So those people are effectively having a permanent blackout for the past 3 years. Well, Panyaza Lusufi seems to have gone and found the money to go and buy those particular transformers across the province. But load shedding.
And Samgele, I saw also another transformer being delivered there in Ekurhuleni in one of the communities. So certainly a lot of focus on this. But some opposition parties have been raising questions about this, and they're not the only ones. A number of people are asking just how much diesel are we burning?
The interesting thing about this question of diesel, Andre Derrita, who was CEO of Eskom, arguably during its worst period of load shedding, says Eskom was burning diesel in the past few months, especially these past 3 months heading to next week's election, in order to make sure that the lights are on so that people's votes are not negatively affected and that they choose their decision not based on load shedding. But it seems as if he may have been wrong, particularly with what energy experts are saying. But let's look at what Eskom has been spending on these open gas turbines. Look at the 2019-2020 financial year, 5.8 billion rands was spent on these open gas turbines procuring diesel. You go to 2020-2021, 5.75 billion rands was spent within the 2020-2021 financial year. 2021-2022, 8.6 billion rands on diesel. Go to 2022-2023 financial year, 21.25 billion rands was spent on these open gas turbines, diesels that Eskom was using to keep the lights on. Then, interestingly, this financial year, starting from last year, ending earlier on this year, 2023-2024, 23.38 billion rands was spent by Eskom in procuring diesel for these open gas turbines.
So, Samgela, this is very interesting, but I wonder then, if we're speaking about these figures, what does their budget then tell us about how much is allocated for diesel?
Interestingly, if we look at how much is allocated for financial years in diesel, you look at the 2024-2025 financial year, it is 25.5 billion rands that is allocated for this particular financial year for the procurement of diesel for these open gas turbines, particularly when Eskom's generating units are broken down in majority. You look at the quarterly budget, April to June 2024, it is 5.8 billion rands that is budgeted for that particular period. Then you come to, as of the 9th of May, how much was spent? 1.1 billion rands was spent on these particular gas turbines and diesel in order to keep the lights on, which is a drastic reduction in particularly how much Eskom spends on a monthly quarter when it comes to these particular diesel open gas turbines. And knowing that the power utility, particularly if you go to the election period where former President Jacob Zuma was coming for his second term, there the ANC was very strict on particularly Eskom to say that the lights must be kept on at all costs. I remember one year when Malusi Gigaba was the ANC's head of elections in one of Jacob Zuma's elections. He was in charge, or particularly as the Deputy Minister of Public Enterprises, in making sure that the lights are kept on, but making sure that the ANC's election message is kept alive by making sure that the lights are kept on. You go to 2021 local government elections. Eskom had said through the minister at the time that there would be no load shedding. Just on the eve of that particular local government election, the ANC dipped under 50% for the very first time. Boom, there was load shedding. Bungyo.
And Samgela, all of this, of course, is happening. A number of South Africans have their own ideas as to why we're here. But it's quite interesting when you listen to Eskom. I was speaking to the board chair at some point, and he says that it's interesting that while we've had over 50 days of no rolling blackouts, South Africans have become so skeptical about what they are seeing unfold before their eyes. So let's talk about that, because rolling blackouts have been here for quite some time now.
Rolling blackouts for the first time came during the era of the prodigal son, Thabo Mvunelwa-Mbeki, the former president of the country and former president of the governing party, who in his tenure, certain power stations were closed down. Eskom reportedly said they had written a white paper in the trajectory of the country, signaling that the country would face electricity problems. Well, but the projects to build Medupi and Kusile originated during the era of former President Mbeki, implemented in the era of former President Jacob Zuma partially. Well, you know the escalating costs of those particular power stations.
And the defects. And
the defects where Hitachi was involved. But let's look at rolling blackouts. Rolling blackouts have been there for the past 16 years, from 2008. 2023, there were 280 days of rolling blackouts, Bungiu. That is a staggering 6,950 hours of blackouts in 2023, which was arguably one of the worst years of load shedding, particularly if you look at the effects on the economy, you look at how it affected matric results as well of some particular students. Some students had to try to study for their matric in darkness through Eskom's failures, how businesses were not performing optimally due to this particular issue of load shedding. Stage 6 load shedding. For the very first time, we had stage 6 load shedding in 2019. You'd remember that trip, President Ramaphosa, working trip he had taken to Egypt. He had to curtail it, cut it short, come back into the country, particularly after he made those claims at Megawatt Park of a sabotage at the Kuiberg nuclear power station. Till to date, no one has ever been prosecuted on that particular issue or allegation of sabotage at the power utility. You go to 2020, Kimberley, January 8th statement of the ANC. David Mabuza, the former deputy president, he came out and said the president may have been misled by the Minister of Public Enterprises and the board of Eskom on this particular issue. Jabu Mabuza, the late, fell on his sword on that particular issue as the chairperson of the power utility Eskom. But interestingly, Dan Morgane, the new group chief executive of Eskom, Dr. Khosiantso Ramokgopa, the minister, and also you go to the Eskom's board chairperson now. They are saying when winter comes in the next week or two, load shedding will be kept to stage 2 because of the brilliant performance of the men and women at the power utility and all of those units of Eskom, Kusile coming on board, Metupe assisting as well, and also we will look later on, particularly at the role of independent power producers, the amount of electricity that is outside of the grid, Bongiwe. But let's basically just listen to what the electricity minister, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, had to say about how South Africa is reaping the rewards of ending load shedding.
The other factor that is really driving this improvement is the fight against your UCLF. So you can see that it has come considerably down in megawatts terms. I mean, we moved from a situation where we're at about 15,000 megawatts. If you go to the baseline of May 2023, we're just shy of 18,000 megawatts. So you see that if you had to go to week number 7, we are sitting now at 11,110 megawatts. Significantly better than the same period last year where we were at 16,000 megawatts. So we've been able to claw back 5,000 megawatts.
That's the Minister of Electricity, who is adamant that Eskom has turned around the corner. Let's look at how Eskom has been performing on the energy availability factor as well as unplanned capability loss factor of these power utility stations. But one wonders if South Africans actually do believe the Minister of Electricity, Bongiwe. But facts, as we have them, are saying they're on the right trajectory, they're burning less diesel. All these coal-powered units are performing optimally at this point in time. Unplanned maintenance is kept. These units are maximized when it comes to their maintenance. As you've heard him say in the past, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, that they've gone to each and every coal-powered generating unit within Eskom, looked at their shortcomings, looked at their positives. But interestingly, if we were to be historical, there was one particular coal-powered station at Eskom that was the best performing coal-powered station, but it was decommissioned, Komati. You go to Komati power station today, it's basically a ghost town. The ripple effect of closing that particular power station on the economy of that area in Mpumalanga, the mamas that sell on the streets, the informal economy that has been negatively affected. Barbara Creasy, the minister within the country, when he spoke at COP, particularly recently with Minister Gwede Mantashe, she was very adamant of the unjust that this just transition has done to the people of Mpumalanga, particularly that rural community of Komati. And it just tells you, if South Africa does not handle this just transition properly, it will have an adverse effect on the economy of the country, on the livelihoods of South Africans, particularly in the coal belt of Mpumalanga.
And Samgel, of course, it also raises another concern even around the issue of, people who are saying with all of these shortcomings, technically, then you're saying that it is man-made. It's a man-made problem because then you need the required skills. But when we look at the issue of the energy availability factor, we're hearing that now we've reached the 70% mark. How have things been looking before? Well,
on the energy availability factor, if we were to trace it back to 2001, the energy availability factor was sitting at 64.2%. You look at unplanned or the units that were out of commission due to breakdowns, you had about 20% of them in 2021 that were out, that was out for maintenance. You go to 2022, there was an energy availability factor of 62% within the grid in South Africa, particularly of the power utility Eskom. You look at a slight increase of about 3.4% of those that were not in circulation at the time, that were not working and providing electricity into the grid. It was sitting at 23.4% in 2022. Then you go to 2023, which was Eskom's ugly worst performance throughout the period of 16 years since we've had load shedding within the country. And that coincides with the era of Andre de Ruyter, who is the former Group Chief Executive Officer of that power utility. The energy availability factor was sitting at 56%. 56%. You go to the breakdowns, those that were unplanned capability loss factor within Eskom, it was sitting at 32%, Bongiwe, in 2023, which ultimately culminated in Andre de Ruyter being chucked out of the power utility. He ultimately asked for 3 months to stay on board. Then ultimately a decision was taken that he must leave there and then. And today we're seeing Dan Morakani at the helm, a chemical engineer by profession. He used to work at the power utility with the likes of Machela Koko. They essentially grew up at Eskom after they finished their university days at the University of Cape Town, UCT. They ultimately went on to work at the power utility, worked their way up the ranks of Eskom. At some point, Majela Koko was head of generation. Dan Morakani was also there. Particularly, you know the story of how they then got embroiled with the Gupta's allegations of state capture at the power utility, which Dan Morakani still faces today, which Majela Koko still faces in the counter allegations that they have against one another. Then you move to the energy availability factor that is there today. Hosienzo Ramahupa at the helm as minister, with those powers being taken from Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Public Enterprises, powers being taken from Minister Gwede Mantashe, who is at Mineral Resources and Energy, and given to the Minister in the Presidency responsible for electricity, Dr. Hosienzo Ramahupa. Energy availability factor in May sitting at 70.7% for the very first time in about 2-3 years. Breakdowns gone down from that 32% of 2023, gone down now to 29%, and it tells you that some work is being done.
So Samgele, in light of all of this then, briefly let's look at the issue of maintenance, because that's where Eskom also has been facing a lot of criticism, that maybe it's not doing what it's supposed to.
On the issue of maintenance, Bongio, on a good year, where all of Eskom's power generating units, coal-powered units, are working perfectly. You go to the nuclear power station, Kuiberg, if it's working perfectly as well. We do need an 80% energy availability factor on the grid to avoid any form of load shedding. Unplanned maintenance or unplanned maintenance is then kept at 20%. 80% energy availability factor to power up the whole country and able to export electricity freely and still have some electricity in abundance. You need 80% energy availability factor. 20% would be out for maintenance.
So then, in light of all of this, one then, goes back to what the finance minister had to say last year, especially around the people that would have solar rooftop panels and the incentives thereof. Did that at least ease the pressure somewhat on Eskom when it comes to the demand?
Interestingly, if you look at that particular issue of these solar PV energy has greatly increased in the past 2 years. At the moment, the energy coming from solar PV by individuals and businesses is 4,400 megawatts, which is over 90% of Kusile's maximum generating capacity of 4,800 megawatts by all 6 units of Kusile. This excludes Eskom's commissioned solar-powered procured projects. This particularly excludes any of Eskom's procured solar units, any of the window periods that the minister has sent out. If you look at 2022, the megawatts that were there outside of Eskom were sitting at 983 megawatts in March 2022. June 2023, Bongiwe, the megawatts outside of the Eskom grid are sitting at 4,411 megawatts. So it essentially tells you that the announcements made by the Minister of Finance on this particular issue is reaping the rewards, as those whom are having their own businesses are taking that particular avenue of having this particular solar energy for themselves, which is outside of the grid, which is some of them is subsidized by government in order to alleviate the pressure on the grid itself, in order for South Africans to have electricity, for some businesses to operate optimally, knowing that there would be no load shedding. Boom.
Quite interesting, and we are going towards an election next week, so lots of focus and lots of concern to see exactly, do things stay the same? Do we stay at stage 2? What happens then? So Samgele, I'm going to leave that to you in order to be able to make sense of everything.
Well, what we can say is that South Africans can truly ever know whether this was an election ploy or not post the election. But we can't take away the fact that government has put in initiatives and steps, particularly after the announcement of that energy availability energy action plan by the president to particularly try and finally resolve this particular issue of load shedding, and knowing the disastrous appointment that they had made, in the words of Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, of the appointment of Andre Dareta, which took Eskom back a few steps, particularly when it comes to energy generation, despite, to give him credit as well, of getting Eskom out of the black dark hole it was in financially, with over 432 billion rands in debt, with government taking over of that debt in order to write off Eskom's debt. But next week, we will certainly look at the election results, as elections will be announced next week sometime, as we do know that South Africans will be going to the polls come the 29th of May. And this electricity issue has been branded as a political football by those political players. But experts have also said that government has been doing fairly well in resolving this particular crisis. But you, as South Africans, those who've been load shed permanently without those particular units that generate electricity, transformers in areas such as Ekurhuleni, areas such as Soweto, in Mogale City as well, where they've had no electricity due to the blowing up of these particular transformers. You are saying that we've been experiencing this load shedding for the longest of time, but others have been getting load shedding here and there, but do have electricity. Next week, we also look at the 3 fears of government. We look at how South Africans, do they think that the democratic project has failed? Looking at how South Africans are shunning the elections. 2, is South Africa over liberation politics? Knowing that if you take ANC, you take EFF, you take ATM, and you take MK, that is about 70% of the electorate, which is the 2/3 majority. Lastly, the Western Cape, the hegemony of the minority. Is it being sustained, or is that particular project failing, knowing that the colored community is shunning the Democratic Alliance?